A faint, muffled yelp rose from the drainage tunnel, a thread of sound through the rain-wet air where the mouth had slumped in the night. The earth had poured down in a shallow fan, reeds pressed flat, gravel beaded with water. He knelt and listened between gusts. The sound faded, then found him again, the small scratch of claws against metal somewhere under the collapse. He placed his palm on the bank. The surface was cool, beneath it a warmer seam, like a breath lying still. He let the quiet draw a map. He moved without hurry. Fresh slides behave like memory, eager to repeat themselves. Runoff whispered beyond the blockage, tapping the culvert's ribs out of sight. He angled his body away from the fragile center and pinched the outer crust away in clumps, rolling each into his palm so nothing rattled back. Between motions, he stopped to measure the ditch's silence. Whine, pause, breath, pause, scratch. Fear was keeping time, and he let its rhythm lead his choices. The wind pushed reeds, then rested. He spoke once, a soft thread offered to a smaller thread. "Easy, little one." The words were quiet enough to disappear into damp clay. Nails skimmed metal in answer, tentative, then still. He set his jacket on the bank as a pad and used the side of his thumbs to smooth a shallow bowl rather than pry a deep hole at the arch. Surface mud lifted clean. The deeper layer clung, kneaded by roots and dull chips of stone. He kept his hands gentle so the roof would not remember the night and fall again. The field stated the storm without needing his witness. Grasses kinked where wind had pressed them. A fence gate ticked at its hinge. A bottle turned in a puddle until a reed stopped it. Along the bank, he found a blurred stamp of a larger paw, half washed but aimed at the culvert. Dogs choose places like this when weather comes or when ground promises a den. He had seen beds under willow roots and blankets of dead leaves turned to shelter. The print was enough to say the choice had been made here too. He drilled a finger-width bore with a willow twig, turning it between thumb and forefinger until resistance eased, then withdrew to feel a thread of air gather against his knuckles. The whine changed when the air reached it, not louder, only less ragged. He set his ear to the mud. Runoff drummed faintly inside, rounder now, as if cupped by a pocket of space. He widened the bore by a nail's width and stopped. The culvert's ribs gave him a count, 3 ridges, then 4, then a wet seam marking the curve. He worked a second breathing hole a hand's breadth from the first, so the strain would split. Mud slicked his knuckles and the smell lifted. Earth, leaf mold, and a thin sweetness of wet fur mixed with stale milk. He watched the bank for signs, a fresh crack, a sag along the edge, the trickle changing its mind. He laid small stones into a curb above the openings so any water would steer away. When the wind pressed through reeds, their hush braided with the whimpering below. The ditch learned their shared pace. He answered the next cry with quiet emotion. Digging became a conversation in which he tried to speak less than he listened. He slid his fingers into the second opening until they touched cool and teased the thin wall that separated the holes, scraping with the upper edge of a nail. When the 2 hollows met, a soft hiss moved between them. The tunnel's smell grew stronger. He leaned close enough that the rim warmed under his breath and felt the earth return, only breathing, patient and present. He spoke once more because a voice can be a rope. "I hear you." The ground swallowed the words and gave back the tap-tap of claws, then a long sigh that unwound into quiet. He rested to let the air find its balance. More rain threatened, then drifted elsewhere, leaving the scent of wet soil darker and clean. He shifted his knees to keep feeling and continued shaping the bowl, supporting a slight sag with his knuckles while he cleared a thumb's depth beneath it. When he withdrew, the roof held. He cut a shallow trench alongside the culvert to ease pressure on the arch, slicing cake-thick mud into strips with the twig and lifting each away. Care has its own geometry, no sudden voids, no big gestures, no invitation to slide. The ribs felt like ladder rungs under his fingertips, a count he could trust. The dog rustled softly against metal, and the ring travelled along the pipe, small but exact. Nearness was a note, not permission. He kept the volume low and matched the breathing he could not see. Light shifted as a cloud thinned, and the wet ground brightened briefly, then settled back. He did not chase it. He checked the bank for new cracks, found none, and returned to the openings. The hiss of air had confidence now. The next whine came as a ribbon rather than a knot. He built his curb higher with 2 more stones and watched water test it and slide away. The ditch accepted this order. He was glad without letting gladness speed his hands. He set another clod on his jacket to keep the slope clean. He rested his hands to let blood return to his fingertips, rubbing grit from the half-moons of his nails. A crow crossed the field and settled on the far post, narrow as a sliver of shadow, watching, because birds watch everything that changes shape. He pinched a thin ribbon of clay from the first opening, and the roof settled a fraction, then stopped, as if reminded it could. He waited for the count of 10 and for the breathing to answer. It did, a small rhythm that matched the drift of the reeds. He had not solved anything. He had made a place where breathing was easy enough to stay. Help could widen the breach later, or a board could brace what wanted to slip. That would be the next hour's work. This hour was air. He let the truth anchor him to slow moves, a scrape, a scoop, a pause that measured whether the ground approved. The dog's chest worked against metal with a steadier pattern. He answered with patience. The runoff kept whispering. The field listened with him and said nothing more. He tested the air with his cheek, feeling the faintest draught, then used the twig to shave a sliver from the second hole so the two would share their work. The smell from within shifted again, more animal than earth now. He set the twig aside and pressed his palm flat to promise stillness. He sat back on his heels and let ordinary sounds return to their size. Water finding its run, reeds brushing one another. The hinge's small complaint. Evening was far yet, but the light already carried a tempered patience. He placed his palm flat where warmth bled through and felt it answer the contact. The whimper that followed was not alarm, it was presence. He smoothed the mud beside the openings to honor the shape they had become, then stayed a while longer, listening to the ground continue to breathe. The next morning brought a pale, wet light across the ditch. The ground still carried the memory of rain, its surface slick, its scent thick with clay and damp roots. The small breathing holes he had opened the evening before still held, narrow mouths exhaling the faint warmth of life trapped inside. He had left it as safe as he could through the night, returning now with simple tools, a short-handled shovel, a tin bucket, and a split board he had pried from a broken fence. None of it seemed much against the weight of earth, but each piece carried the promise of care. He pressed his palm against the bank. A tremor, softer than before, but present, pulsed back through the soil. A thin whine followed, weaker than the night's cries, but steady. The dog was still there. He crouched low, placing the bucket and board beside him, and let his hand linger until the sound came again. Only then did he start. The shovel cut clean lines along the outer edge, shallow strokes that lifted clods rather than pried them. He made each movement measured, conscious of how quickly a misjudged angle could send the roof collapsing. The bucket filled slowly with the sodden weight. Each time he set it aside, he checked the air holes, listening for the rasp of small lungs inside. The earth gave him permission to continue. As the trench deepened, he slid the board into place against the arch, wedging it gently under a lip of clay. It wasn't much, just a rib of wood to hold where the culvert's curve wanted to fold. Still the soil eased against it, and he felt the pressure shift. The dog answered with a scratch along the pipe, a sound so thin it might have been mistaken for rain. He whispered to the ground, not to be heard, but to be steady. "Almost there." The light shifted behind him as the sun moved past cloud. He caught the change only as it touched the mud, brightening its surface before fading again. His hands were black to the wrists, nails packed with grit, but he kept them sure. At last, when he had worked away enough of the surface, a gap began to open where the pipe curved. From it slid a sliver of paw, tiny, shaking, each claw rimmed with mud. It pawed once against the air, then stilled. He set the shovel aside and reached with bare fingers. The paw was cold, slick with clay, the pad soft as wet leaves. He pressed his thumb against it, slow and firm, until it stirred again. A faint whimper slipped out, half muffled. Then a rush of frantic scrabbling as the body behind it tried to force through. The board held, the roof did not fall. He cupped the paw, supporting it, and began to clear the edges with his other hand. A muzzle appeared first, smeared with silt, nostrils flaring in sharp, shallow pulls. Then the head, shaking, ears plastered flat against a skull too thin. The body followed in fits, ribs pressing against skin, fur darkened by water and earth. When at last the shoulders slid free, the rest of the pup spilled into his palms with a soft weight that trembled but did not resist. The dog was slick and shivering, every breath quick and shallow, his sides rattling like reeds in wind. The man drew the puppy against his chest, wrapping him in the jacket that had waited on the bank since dawn. The fabric swallowed the small form, leaving only a nose and pair of closed lids exposed. For a moment, the pup shook as though the earth was still falling. Then, pressed into the fold of cloth, he drew a longer breath, then another, each one smoother than the last. His paws twitched once, claws catching in the lining, before he let them curl against the warmth. The man whispered again, soft enough that even the reeds might not carry it. "You're safe now." The words were less promise than rhythm, something for the pup to match his breath against. He sat back from the culvert, the board still bracing the fragile arch, the air holes open, the mouth not yet cleared. He would need to return for the rest, to see if others had been caught behind, but for now his arms carried one life, and it was enough. He kept the jacket pressed close, feeling the heart within hammer, then slow, like rain easing after storm. The field around them resumed its quiet conversation. A crow moved along the fence line, wings shaking droplets from wire. Water in the ditch found its channel, flowing smooth again where the trench had been cut. Each small sound marked the return of ordinary life, a world that had kept moving even while one small creature waited beneath earth. The pup stirred once more, lifting his head briefly from the jacket's fold. His eyes opened, clouded, blinking against the light, but not to look at the man. They turned back, toward the dark mouth of the culvert, as though some thread remained tied within. A low whine pulsed from his throat, softer now, but insistent. His gaze lingered, unsteady, yet searching. The man followed it, eyes settling on the shadowed arch, still half sealed with mud. He knew the work was not finished. The board groaned slightly under its weight, soil pressing close around the pipe. He let the pup's head sink back into the jacket and held him steady, his thumb rubbing gently along the fur between small ears. The wine faded, but the eyes kept drifting toward the tunnel, even as exhaustion pulled them shut. Rain threatened again, distant in the wind's change, but held back. The man rose carefully, the bundle secure against his chest, and stepped away from the ditch. Behind him, the culvert remained, silent except for the water's murmur. In his arms, the rescued pup breathed with steadier rhythm, but his small body carried the memory of Earth's weight, and his eyes still reached for the dark that had held him. He would not fight that memory now. He would only keep the warmth steady, the jacket wrapped close until the trembling gave way to rest. The pup's chest rose and fell, each cycle slower, each one stronger. And through the fabric, the man felt the smallest claw press once more, a reminder that the earth was not empty yet. The shed kept the soft smell of wool, soap, and damp straw. The jacket he had dried overnight lay folded like a nest, and inside it the puppy's narrow body rose and fell with a steadier rhythm than the night before. When the kettle clicked off, steam lifted from a shallow dish. Warm water touched with milk, not much, just enough to coax a swallow. At the sound, the pup raised his head, licked his lips, and slid forward until his chin found the rim. He lapped in careful sips, pausing between each to listen toward the door, as if a thread outside might be pulled too far away if he drank without caution. The pauses were brief, but they were always in the same direction. The hands that steadied the dish moved without fuss. He kept the liquid shallow so every swallow would be easy. When the pup coughed, he drew the dish back and let the throat calm before offering it again. The lapping resumed, steadier now, and the small paws flexed against the jacket's fold as if testing their own shape. Before dawn, he had dried the little body with a towel, lifting each leg in turn, pressing water from the coat with flat hands and patience. Warmth held now, but the pup still watched the seam of light at the door, ears twitching to sounds the man could not sort, a gate tapping, a reed scraping the step, a far crow. He set the dish aside and lowered his hand. The pup leaned into the weight of his palm, taking comfort from pressure as much as heat. When the hand lifted, small teeth closed on the cuff, not to bite, only to hold. The tug was gentle and sure. He let the sleeve go slack so cloth would not resist, then rubbed once behind the ear. "Drink a little," he said, no louder than the heater's tick. The pup took a few final licks, released the cuff, and eased to the floor. Hindquarters uncertain, tail low and still. He stood in the door's narrow brightness and drew the air in quick, practical breaths. He opened the door only enough that the scrape would not startle. Cool morning pushed into the room, carrying wet earth, iron from tools, and the hay's old sweetness. The pup measured the outside with his nose before putting weight to it. He wobbled over the threshold and set a deliberate path across flattened grass where boots had pressed a line the evening before. Each pause ended in a thin whine, not alarm, but reference, as if he were checking his place against a map kept under his ribs. The man followed at a distance that kept his shadow from the pup's shoulders. Help, he knew, is mostly nearness without pressure. The ground fell to the ditch, where clay showed the imprint of the night's slide. There the pup stopped, claws on the lip, and peered along the bank until the dark curve of the culvert found his gaze. The board wedged under the arch still held where it had been left. The breathing holes were open, their rims damp but firm. He lowered his head and breathed into the nearest opening, then lifted and breathed again, a ritual almost like counting. He did not bark. He pressed his chest to the mud and made a sound so small it might have been mistaken for wind. Then he raised one paw and touched the same seam, withdrew, and touched it again. The man knelt and set his hands wide, so the bank would feel him as weight, not pry. He watched for tiny shifts and found none. Fingers read the board, then the roof above it, learning a hold that felt patient but not endless. Leaning near, he felt a faint exchange of air against his wrist hairs. The smell leaving the tunnel had changed. The earth remained, but a thin sweetness rode with it, the trace of milk given and given again. He slid his palm under the pup's chest and eased him back 2 hand widths away from the lip. The puppy pushed forward once, then accepted the place and kept his nose arrowed at the seam. He fetched the short shovel and the bucket and returned with their edges clean. The pup stayed where he had left him, tail still, eyes fixed. He began as before, taking from the outside first, so the arch would carry less. The slices were thin and regular, the bucket filling in slow quarters. Between each cut he paused to listen for complaint from the roof or a change in the whispering within. None came. The puppy's sound continued, steady as breath, each note falling in the same place, the same insistence that a spot on the bank mattered more than the rest. When the trench gained an inch, air from the nearest hole warmed by a hair. He laid a second brace against the upper edge and tapped it in with the heel of his hand. With a strip of bark, he smoothed a channel above the openings so any trickle would slide away. Protection before progress. He obeyed that order as if it were law. The pup pressed his paw to the seam again. With the twig he had used yesterday, the man loosened that line by no more than a fingernail's width. The roof sighed in the smallest way, a movement more felt than heard, and then held fast. He did not put his eye to the dark. He turned his cheek to the opening, to read the draft instead. "Show me," he said, the words simple as a nod. The puppy edged closer and trembled, but stayed when the man's forearm barred the lip. Inside, water met metal with a soft clink. There were no new sounds, only the sense of body in a small room where the earth had not yet decided whether to let go or to hold. He chose the pace that had already saved one life. Scoop, pause, listen, reinforce, then remove. Once the board complained, a low creak like a tired door, and fell quiet when he eased his weight away. The pup's whine never tangled with fear. It spoke of presence, of a world not finished. A crow sidled on a fence post and watched the long, careful motions that did not break the bank's trust. He stopped and laid his hand to the opening until his skin took on the tunnel's cool. The pup lowered his head into the space between the hands and breathed, then rested his chin on the wrist without asking for more. It was not comfort he wanted. It was nearness to the place that held the rest of his world. They did not press farther. Light and weather would allow more work, but patience had earned more than speed. He lifted the pup and set him on high, dry grass. The small body turned back toward the culvert, pressed a paw once into the bank, and then, conceding to his own limits, lay with his nose pointing at the seam. What needed doing had become plain without words. This was no single rescue completed and put away. It was a shape still inside the hill, a room held open by will and weight, waiting for someone to widen air into space. He had seen prints yesterday, he had smelled milk today, and the line between those facts pointed here as surely as the small paw did. Wind moved through the hedgerow and shook a fine spray from the leaves. He gathered the tools, lifted the pup, and felt the warmth return through the jacket's fold. The culvert lay ahead, unchanged, and the work remained. The day did not announce a plan. It offered light, tools, and the steady measure of an animal's insistence. He crossed the yard toward the shed, not to end the effort, but to keep the strength it would require, while behind him the bank kept its shape and its secret for one more hour. In the doorway, the pup glanced once toward the shadowed arch and settled, breathing a slow, even line that carried the same message his paw had given the earth: not finished. The work began again at first light, the air still heavy with night's rain. Dew clung to the grass, and each step down the slope pressed dark footprints into the bank. The board set the day before still braced the culvert's arch, its grain swollen from damp but firm. The man laid a hand against it, listening as he had done every morning since the rescue began. The tunnel breathed back at him, faint and uneven, carrying a smell sharper than soil, an animal smell, warm and stale, mixed with something older, weightier. He steadied his tools and began widening the breach. Each cut with the shovel was deliberate, no deeper than a palm, mud lifted in small slabs, dropped into the bucket with a low thud. Between strokes he stopped to feel the bank, measuring whether the soil shifted or sighed in warning. The surviving pup waited at his side, crouched low to the ground, his nose never leaving the dark line where earth met pipe. Now and again he gave a whimper, soft and drawn, not for attention, but as though calling into the tunnel itself. His paws pressed into the clay, claws digging shallow ruts, but he did not move forward without permission. The man added a second brace, tapping it gently beneath the arch to spread the load. The soil creaked but held. With his free hand he shaped a narrow trench to guide the runoff away, a small river he carved with patience, ensuring that no trickle would flood the pocket inside. Sweat mixed with damp earth on his brow, but he did not hurry. This kind of work asked for silence, for restraint, and for respect. At last the board gave way to a wider opening, just large enough to peer inside. He lowered his face to the dark, eyes adjusting slowly, and shapes began to form. There was a cavity, smaller than a barrel, its ceiling bowed low with packed soil. And there, filling almost all of it, was a body, the mother dog, her flanks pressed against the pipe's wall, her spine arched just enough to leave a hollow beneath her chest. Her fur was caked with mud, her muzzle buried into earth. One foreleg stretched stiff toward the mouth, as though even in stillness she had tried to push the last of her strength outward. Beside her, curled into that shallow space she had created, lay two pups. One was still, its body small and lifeless, head resting against the mother's ribs. The other shifted weakly, its nose pressed tight into her side, as if the warmth could still be drawn from her. The man watched without speaking, his breath steady, his chest heavy with what was plain. The larger body had made a chamber where there should have been none, and in doing so had bought air, long enough for one pup to survive. He slid his arm inside slowly, careful not to disturb the delicate ceiling. His hand found the living pup and cupped its body, slick with soil but warm. He drew it gently into the light, and the survivor at his side rushed forward at once, pressing his face against the new arrival. They nosed and whined, their small sounds overlapping, until the rescued pup stilled, burying his muzzle deep in his sibling's damp fur. His body pressed close, refusing to separate even when the man tried to lift him back. The man eased both pups onto the jacket laid on the grass, wrapping them in its folds. Still the survivor squirmed free and crawled toward the mother's body in the tunnel, lodging himself against her chest as if the soil itself had not taken her. His cry was quiet but unrelenting, a plea with no answer but the one already given. The man reached in again, this time with both hands, and with slow, respectful effort, he drew the mother from her earthen chamber. She was heavier than he expected, her body stiffened by the pressure of hours. He laid her on the grass, smoothing the mud from her muzzle with his thumb, as though such small dignity might return some softness to the stillness. The survivor immediately pressed against her side, climbing onto her ribs, pawing at her face. He licked once at her closed eye, then curled against her neck, as though to sleep. The man did not intervene, not at first. The earth had spoken its terms, and the pup's need to understand them had to be answered in its own time. He sat back on his heels, eyes lowered, and let the field speak instead, reeds, moving in the morning wind, the far-off call of a crow, water finding its path through the ditch. After a long while, he reached forward and drew the pup gently away, folding him once more into the jacket's warmth. This time the pup did not fight, but he kept his eyes fixed on the still body beside him. The man wrapped both living pups together and held them against his chest. His arms were strong, but his movements were soft, as if carrying something more fragile than weight. He dug a shallow grave by the hedgerow, the soil dark and damp, and lined it with reeds pulled from the ditch. He laid the mother inside, her body curved as it had been in the tunnel, as though still sheltering the young pressed to her chest. The lifeless pup he placed against her. The two joined in silence, their forms inseparable from the choice she had made. With slow hands he covered them, patting the earth level, pressing it down just enough that wind would not lift it, but not so firm that it looked unkind. The surviving pup whimpered once as the mound rose, then pressed his nose into the jacket's fold, eyes closing though his body did not rest. The man sat a while longer, letting the new grave settle into the field. No words rose to meet the moment. Only the truth of what lay beneath, a body that had turned itself into air, into space, into time, just enough time for one small life to emerge. When at last he stood, the pups in his arms, the mound of earth at the hedgerow caught the wind, the grass bending across it like a kind of covering. The day pressed forward, but the pocket of silence remained, holding what the tunnel had shown. The shape of sacrifice was plain, and its weight would not leave those who had witnessed it. The earth by the hedgerow had been pressed smooth, the mound covered in reeds, so it blended with the field's natural line. Nothing marked it but the curve of soil and the way the grass bent slightly under the morning wind. The man had stood over it for a time with his cap in his hands, silent, letting the quiet hold the meaning words could not. Now, in the slow light of late morning, he turned back toward the yard, carrying the jacket with its small bundle pressed close. The pup was still at first, a warm weight tucked against his chest, nose hidden in the cloth. Only the faint rise and fall of ribs showed he had not drifted too far from rest. But as the man stepped past the lip of the ditch and into the open, the bundle stirred. A head lifted, ears limp and muddy, eyes half closed against the brightness. For a long moment the pup gazed not at the man, nor at the shed ahead, but back across the grass toward the tunnel mouth. The culvert lay quiet now, its arch braced by boards, the small breathing holes caked with damp. Water trickled beneath, running smooth again after the soil's collapse had been eased. There was no sound of claws or muffled cries, only the steady hush of the ditch. The pup gave a single whine, soft and questioning, then tucked his chin once more into the jacket's fold. It was not resistance, only memory, a final look into the place that had given him breath and taken the rest. The man paused to honor it. He let his arms rest and followed the pup's gaze, letting the silence stretch. The shed stood waiting, but he did not hurry. The moment belonged to the ground and to the body it held, and to the bond that still tied one small survivor to the shadowed arch. When at last he moved again, his steps left broad prints in the softened clay, and beside them the faint indentations of paws. The surviving pup, though weak, had wriggled free of the jacket's fold, enough to stretch one leg forward, pressing pads into the earth with each sway of the man's stride. They left a trail together, human and animal, away from the ditch and toward the warmth of the yard. At the shed's doorway, he set the jacket down on clean straw. The pup clambered out unsteadily, tottering a few steps before collapsing in a curl. His breathing slowed quickly into the even rhythm of sleep. The man covered him lightly with the edge of the jacket and stepped outside once more. He walked the length of the yard, looking back toward the ditch, then toward the hedgerow. The field had already begun to reclaim both places. Wind shifted reeds, smoothed grass, and carried the sound of water onward, as if life were resuming its ordinary pace. He did not disturb it further. He left the ground as it was, carrying only the weight of what had passed. In the ditch, paw prints already blurred at the edges, softening under the morning air. Near the hedgerow, the mound seemed only another shape in the field, yet to those who had seen it made, it would always carry more than earth. The pup stirred once inside the shed, stretching his legs before tucking them close again. His body was still fragile, but his breath no longer rattled. In sleep, he shifted his nose toward the door, where light fell in a narrow beam across the floor. The man watched from outside, and the sight was enough. Some rescues are not loud or sudden. They are slow walks into light, guided by memory and by what is left behind. By midday, the yard was quiet. Only the faint trail of prints across damp clay and a small mound by the hedgerow told the story of what had been given and what had been kept. The wind moved through the grass, erasing edges, softening lines. The man stepped back inside, closing the door gently, while outside the field kept its silence, carrying forward the memory in its own unspoken way.